Welcome to Godless and Grounded. Imagine living 2,000 years ago in a land filled with poverty, oppression, and religious laws that controlled almost every detail of life. In that world, a man named Jesus appeared, speaking in parables and offering teachings that were supposed to guide people toward truth and salvation. Many of his words were inspiring, but many others were confusing, contradictory, and sometimes even impractical. What makes this even more fascinating is that people today still quote these teachings as timeless wisdom, even when they are full of puzzles that don't make sense in everyday life. Let us begin with one of his most quoted sayings, "Love your enemies." At first, this sounds noble. The idea of showing compassion even to those who hurt you sounds like it could reduce conflict in the world. But when you think about it carefully, it creates more questions than answers. How can someone genuinely love an enemy who abuses them, exploits them, or even threatens their family? If a thief breaks into your house, are you supposed to greet him with kindness and let him continue his crime? If a dictator massacres innocent people, are his victims meant to forgive him instead of demanding justice? In real life, enemies cause real harm, and love alone does not solve the damage they do. Justice, protection, and accountability are also necessary. Yet Jesus simply said to love them, leaving out any practical framework for how societies should deal with evil. Another teaching that has puzzled many is when Jesus told his followers not to resist an evil person and to turn the other cheek if someone strikes you. Again, it sounds peaceful on the surface, but think about the consequences. If someone slaps you and you offer your other cheek, you encourage more abuse. In real life, this approach would allow bullies to thrive, criminals to continue, and oppressors to grow stronger. Imagine telling a child who is bullied at school to keep turning the other cheek instead of defending themselves or seeking help. It might create more suffering instead of solving the problem. Societies need resistance against evil, not passivity. Without resistance, slavery would never have been challenged, dictators would never have been overthrown, and human rights would never have been won. Yet the teaching seems to suggest passivity as a virtue. Then we find Jesus saying that if your hand causes you to sin, you should cut it off, and if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. Most Christians today interpret this metaphorically, but if taken literally, it is horrifying. Imagine a world where people actually chopped off body parts whenever they made a mistake. The streets would be filled with mutilated people. Even as a metaphor, it raises the question of why human beings were supposedly created with desires and weaknesses in the first place, only to be told to destroy parts of themselves for having those desires. It is almost as if the rules are set up in a way that humans cannot win. Another confusing saying is when Jesus told a rich man that to enter the kingdom of heaven, he must sell all he owns and give to the poor. This raises the question of whether salvation is only for those who give up everything. If so, very few would qualify. In fact, almost no one today follows this literally. Even the churches that preach this teaching are wealthy institutions with land, property, and enormous treasures. If Christians really believed this command, there would be no billionaires in Christian societies, and churches would not own gold-plated decorations. Instead, wealth and inequality remain, and the teaching becomes a hollow ideal that no one truly practices. Jesus also said that whoever does not hate their father, mother, wife, children, brothers, and sisters cannot be his disciple. This is one of the most troubling statements because it directly attacks family bonds. Hate is a strong word, and while some argue it means love less rather than actual hatred, the text itself is clear and harsh. Why would a loving teacher demand that people hate the very relationships that give them meaning and support? In real life, abandoning family leads to broken homes and suffering. Throughout history, some fanatics have used this verse to justify cutting off loved ones who do not share their beliefs. Families have been torn apart because of a teaching that seems to prioritize blind loyalty to a religious leader over natural love. There is also confusion in Jesus' teaching about faith and miracles. He often said that if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. Yet no one in history has ever moved a mountain by faith. Believers today still face illness, poverty, and natural disasters, no matter how much they pray. The world does not bend to faith in the way Jesus described. This raises a serious problem. If faith really has that much power, why does it never show itself in the way promised? Either people have never had enough faith for 2,000 years, or the teaching itself was unrealistic. Another puzzling aspect is when Jesus said, "Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself." While it encourages trust and peace of mind, it contradicts the reality of life. Planning for tomorrow is essential. If no one worried about tomorrow, no one would save money, prepare for emergencies, or build for the future. Parents worry about feeding their children tomorrow. Farmers worry about crops failing. Doctors worry about epidemics. Society itself is built on planning and worrying about tomorrow. Without it, everything would collapse. So while the teaching sounds poetic, it cannot guide real life. Jesus also said that he came not to bring peace but a sword, which seems to contradict the common image of him as the Prince of Peace. What does it mean for a religious teacher to bring a sword? Historically, this teaching has been linked to division, as families split apart over religious differences. Some Christians argue it is only a metaphor, but the fact remains that Christianity did bring conflict and bloodshed, especially during the Crusades, the Inquisition, and countless wars fought in Jesus' name. The idea that his mission caused division instead of peace is actually one of the most accurate statements, but it is confusing because it clashes with the peaceful image often presented. Even more bewildering are Jesus' teachings about prayer. He said that if you ask for anything in his name, you will receive it. This sounds like a blank check, but in reality, millions of prayers go unanswered every day. People pray for healing, yet diseases remain. They pray for peace, yet wars continue. They pray for loved ones, yet tragedies still happen. The promise of answered prayer does not match the reality of human experience. Believers are often told that their prayers failed because of a lack of faith or because God had other plans, but that makes the original promise meaningless. If the outcome is always uncertain, then the guarantee of "ask and you shall receive" becomes empty. Another confusing teaching is when Jesus cursed a fig tree for not bearing fruit, even though it was not the season for figs. Why would a divine teacher punish a tree for not producing something out of season? The story appears childish, as though he became frustrated and used his supposed power for something trivial. The tree was just following natural cycles, yet it was condemned for it. Some interpret this as symbolic, but the literal story is strange and reflects impulsive behavior rather than wisdom. There is also confusion in his parables. For example, the parable of the workers in the vineyard tells of laborers who worked different hours but were paid the same wage. While the story is meant to illustrate God's grace, in real life it makes no sense. Imagine a workplace where some employees work all day and others only an hour, yet everyone is paid the same. This would cause anger, resentment, and strikes. Justice in society requires fairness, but the parable seems to reward inequality. Even Jesus' promise of eternal rewards creates confusion. He said that the last shall be first and the first shall be last, flipping the natural order of things. While it sounds poetic, it is hard to understand how justice works in such a system. If everyone is reversed, then the last become the first, but then they are no longer last, which contradicts the idea. It creates a loop that does not provide a clear moral framework. Another teaching that troubles many is his prediction of the end times. Jesus said that his generation would not pass away before the world ended and the kingdom of God arrived. Yet 2,000 years have passed, and the world continues. Believers have had to reinterpret this teaching endlessly, claiming it was symbolic or that the timeline was misunderstood. But if taken literally, it was a failed prophecy. This is perhaps one of the most confusing aspects of his teachings, because it suggests either he was mistaken or his words were misrepresented. And then there is his statement that whoever is not against us is for us, while in another place he said whoever is not with me is against me. These two sayings contradict each other directly. In one, neutrality is considered support, while in the other, neutrality is considered opposition. Which one is true? Such contradictions leave followers guessing about what the real standard is. Let us continue exploring the words of Jesus that remain confusing even to this day. One of the most challenging sayings is his command to give to anyone who asks, and not turn away from someone who wants to borrow from you. On the surface, this sounds generous and compassionate. But if we apply it literally, it becomes impossible to live by. Imagine giving to everyone who asks. If someone demands all of your possessions, are you supposed to hand them over? If a person asks for money you cannot afford to lose, do you still have to give it? In real life, unlimited generosity would leave you with nothing and would encourage exploitation. People with bad intentions could take advantage of such a rule, and society would be filled with chaos. Healthy generosity requires balance, but this teaching does not provide that balance. Then there is the saying that the meek shall inherit the earth. While humility and gentleness are admirable qualities, history shows that meekness does not lead to power or inheritance. Nations are not led by the meek, but by the ambitious, the bold, and often the ruthless. Companies are not built by those who remain silent and meek, but by those who compete fiercely. Throughout history, meek individuals have usually been exploited rather than rewarded. This teaching sounds poetic, but it contradicts how human societies actually function. Another strange and confusing moment is when Jesus told his disciples that if they want to be perfect, they should sell their possessions and follow him. Again, perfection is tied to total sacrifice. This creates a troubling image of morality because it equates giving up everything with being perfect. Yet abandoning everything does not necessarily make someone morally superior. A person could be poor and still cruel, dishonest, or unkind. A person could be rich and yet generous and compassionate. Reducing morality to a test of whether or not someone sells all their belongings is simplistic and confusing. We also find Jesus making predictions about the end of the world and his return, known as the Second Coming. He told his followers to be ready at all times because he would come back soon. Yet 2,000 years later, people are still waiting. Whole generations lived and died expecting the end to arrive in their lifetime, and it never did. This creates endless confusion. Was Jesus mistaken? Were his words misinterpreted? Or is it simply that the promise was never meant to be literal? Regardless of the explanation, the fact remains that countless people have lived in fear and expectation of something that never happened. Another confusing teaching is when Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." What does poor in spirit mean? Some interpret it as humility, others as weakness, and others as literal poverty. The vagueness of the phrase makes it hard to pin down. If spiritual poverty is a blessing, then does that mean ignorance or emptiness is good? If material poverty is the blessing, then why does poverty usually bring suffering rather than happiness? The statement sounds comforting but lacks clarity. Even his teaching on forgiveness raises questions. Jesus said to forgive not 7 times but 70 times 7 times. The idea of unlimited forgiveness sounds compassionate, but what happens when forgiveness allows abusers to keep abusing? In real life, unlimited forgiveness without accountability enables harm to continue. Imagine forgiving a corrupt politician 70 times, 7 times, while he keeps stealing from the people. Imagine forgiving an abuser again and again without requiring change. Forgiveness without justice can create cycles of oppression. This teaching, if followed literally, can become dangerous. There is also the strange saying that many who are invited to the kingdom will not be chosen. This creates an image of exclusivity and uncertainty. If many are invited but only few are chosen, then no one can ever be sure of their place. People could follow all the teachings and still not be chosen. It creates confusion about who qualifies and why. The teaching appears to dangle hope in front of people while also threatening rejection, leaving them in constant uncertainty. Another baffling aspect of Jesus' words comes in his interactions with his own family. In one story, his mother and brothers came looking for him, and instead of acknowledging them, he said that his true family were those who followed God's will. To many, this seems dismissive of his actual family ties. It creates confusion about whether biological family has value or whether loyalty to belief must override natural bonds. Such a message can easily be used to justify breaking apart families in the name of religion. We also see confusion in his parable of the prodigal son. The story is often celebrated as one of forgiveness, but if examined carefully, it raises issues of fairness. The younger son wastes everything, then comes back and is rewarded with a feast. The older son, who was loyal and responsible, feels neglected. In real life, rewarding reckless behavior while ignoring responsibility creates resentment. Parents who do this damage family balance. Yet the parable portrays this unfairness as a reflection of divine love. While the intention may have been to show mercy, the story instead raises questions about justice and fairness. Another troubling teaching is the idea that faith can make someone well. On many occasions, Jesus tells people that their faith has healed them. But this teaching has caused enormous confusion in history, as people began to believe that sickness is always linked to a lack of faith. Even today, many Christians believe that if someone remains sick, it must be because they lack faith. This has caused guilt, shame, and even unnecessary deaths when people refuse medical treatment, believing faith alone is enough. The teaching confuses spiritual belief with physical reality. Even his command to be like children creates confusion. He said that unless people become like little children, they cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. While innocence is admirable, children are also known for their lack of knowledge, their dependence, and their inability to make wise decisions. Encouraging people to think like children can easily lead to blind faith and a lack of critical thinking. It sounds poetic, but can be used to discourage questioning and independent thought. Another confusing moment is when Jesus drove out demons from people and allowed them to enter pigs, which then ran into the sea and drowned. This story raises multiple questions. Why punish innocent animals for the sake of an exorcism? What did the pigs do wrong? Why would a divine teacher choose such a strange and destructive method? The story appears more like folklore than moral wisdom and leaves people wondering about its meaning. We also find confusing words in his teaching about divorce. Jesus said that anyone who divorces his wife, except for unfaithfulness, commits adultery. This rule is extremely rigid and leaves no room for situations of abuse, neglect, or other serious issues. In real life, people sometimes need to leave marriages for their safety or well-being. A teaching that condemns almost all divorce ignores the complexity of human relationships and can trap people in harmful situations. Another statement that causes confusion is when Jesus said the first commandment is to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. While loving others is admirable, the demand to love God first creates a hierarchy where devotion to an unseen being is placed above human relationships. This teaching has often been used to justify harming others in the name of loyalty to God. If love for God comes before love for people, then anything can be excused as long as it is claimed to be for God. Even his teaching about faith as small as a mustard seed remains puzzling. He said that with such faith, nothing would be impossible. But human experience shows that faith does not move mountains, cure every disease, or solve all problems. People have prayed with faith for thousands of years, and the natural world remains unchanged. This gap between the promise and the reality leaves followers confused about whether they ever had enough faith or whether the teaching was unrealistic from the start. Another example of confusing teaching is when Jesus said to let the dead bury their own dead. This was his response when a man wanted to bury his father before following him. The statement sounds heartless, as though family duties and basic respect for the dead do not matter. In real life, funerals and mourning are essential parts of love and healing. To dismiss them so coldly is confusing and troubling. Finally, we can look at his teaching about eternal punishment. Jesus often spoke of hell as a place of fire and torment for those who did not follow him. The idea of eternal punishment raises enormous questions about justice. If God is loving and merciful, how can eternal torture be justified for temporary human mistakes? If God created humans with weaknesses, why punish them forever for those weaknesses? The teaching is not only frightening but logically inconsistent, leaving people confused about the nature of divine justice. This raises an important question. If a teaching is so unclear that it requires endless reinterpretation, can it truly be considered divine wisdom? Or is it more likely the product of a man living in a specific time and culture in ways that reflected the limits of his own world? When we examine Jesus' words with honesty, we find not timeless clarity but confusion, contradiction, and complexity. And perhaps that is the clearest truth of all.